we somehow let 10 years pass by because we were just busy with other things. It would have probably been more modest to wait for 20 years, but Mary and I feel well, at least I do, I don't know about Mary, the pressure of advancing age, and decided not to press our luck. So 15 years it is. Yeah. So how long is 15 years? Well, in 2003, SARS invaded Singapore and left after 3 harrowing months. The Americans invaded Iraq and stayed. The iPhone, Facebook, and Instagram didn't yet exist. Binge watching, selfie, and cat cafe were among today's words that were not yet found in the Oxford English Dictionary. Back then, in 2003, Changi Airport had only 2 terminals. We, WhatsApp, were born the same year as the MRT's Northeast Line. But thanks to the fact that our job is much less complicated, and our staff, our printers, and our couriers are quite reliable, we haven't suffered major breakdowns yet. Knock wood, yeah. 2003 was the year Beyoncé made it solo, and we were all finding Nemo. Since 2003, 1.3 billion people have been added to the world's population. That's a 20% increase. Singapore's population has risen by 1.5 million, or more than 1/3. How long is 15 years? We can also get our heads around the number by catching up with some of our earliest readers. In 2003, Omar Chowdhury was a 12-year-old football fan who volunteered to write for us, even though our writers are mainly adults. We took a chance. Today, Omar is head of football intelligence at a British sports consultancy in London, and he still writes for us. In our first year, Andre Teng was a primary school kid at St. Michael's Primary School who loved all things geeky. Today, he is pursuing his MPhil in English at the University of Hong Kong, where he's researching the language of hipster cafes. Judy Goh was a primary pupil at Po Ching School who enjoyed astronomy and the Princess Diaries. Last year, she graduated from Columbia University with a master's in public administration and now works at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Is Judy here, by the way? Okay, she said she would try, but she was probably couldn't because she has to catch a flight this evening to the UN headquarters in New York for a review of Singapore's Sustainable Development Goals. The very first student letter published by WhatsApp came from Radia Ibrahim, a primary 4 pupil of Junyuan Primary. A graduate of the Wee Kim Wee School of Communication, she is today an information officer at the Ministry of Environment and Water Resources, drafting speeches for ministers and working with partners to promote sustainable Singapore movement. She's expecting her first child next month. So in human terms, 15 years is certainly not a short period. The teachers who are here know better than anyone how quickly children grow up, and therefore how finite and fragile are those moments in which we as adults can make a positive difference to their growth. Mary and I, together with our team, have been trying to play a small supporting role through our values-driven journalism, treating current affairs as an endless source of interesting stories that can be used to communicate positive values subtly and creatively. We know grown-up mass media often undermine the efforts of teachers and parents at inculcating positive values. WhatsApp does not believe in completely insulating children from the grown-up world, but we do insist on the right of children to find out about adult things in ways that are psychologically healthy. But today I don't really want to blow our own trumpets. I mean, of course, you can take it for granted that Mary and I started WhatsApp 15 years ago because we did feel we had something to offer. As Seo Peng has said, with our respective expertise, we felt we were uniquely placed to create a newspaper for children consonant with the highest principles of our fields. But I think what was pleasantly surprising and what I wasn't really prepared for, that I'd like to share with you today, is how the experience of writing and editing for children has benefited me. Most of my work is in the adult world. Most of my writing is targeted at concerned citizens, policymakers, fellow academics, and my teaching this year is focused purely on students preparing for their PhDs, not PSLEs. Yet, WhatsApp, which I originally thought of as a welcome distraction, a bit like a CCA, has turned out to be much more relevant, much more central to the rest of my life than I expected. It has forced me to look more critically at the world of adult journalism and see its limitations and flaws. It has compelled me to be more conscious of my craft, to question some of the things that we adult writers do routinely. Let me highlight 3 specific ways it has done this. First, writing clearly for a 10-year-old turns out to be a skill that's also relevant for grown-up writing. This is a multi-level challenge. At the most basic and obvious level, it's a translation challenge, substituting the jargon that obscures so much of public life with simpler, clearer language. At a deeper level, clear writing is an explanatory challenge. Many important problems going on in the world are complex. They have multiple causes and no straightforward solutions. How do we explain these goings-on accurately, but without flooding readers with too much detail? Even more challenging is how to locate the moral center of a story. Modern life may be complex, but there's still a difference between right and wrong. Politics often requires compromise, but that shouldn't dull our conscience and especially our capacity to feel the pain of strangers. Most children's media make their lives easier by sidestepping complex and controversial current events. That's not the WhatsApp way. We exist because we think we owe it to children to give them some clue as to what adults are currently obsessing about or should be obsessing about. The challenge that we've set ourselves is to explain to children simply but not simplistically, not in a childish but in a child-friendly way, the goings-on in our world. And what I've realized through this process is that this is perhaps something that we adults owe to ourselves as well and to one another. You may be following the controversy surrounding Facebook and other social media regarding data privacy, targeted advertising, and so on. Our personal information that they exploit for commercial gain, etc. Now, one thing that users and regulators are rightly not happy with is that these agreements that the companies make us accept before we use their services are impossible for non-lawyers to read and understand. So we end up just clicking accept to who knows what. Now, because some users are children, there's now great pressure to force these companies to simplify the terms of use of Facebook, Twitter, and so on, so that even a 13-year-old can understand it. And I don't think there's any shame in us adults admitting that we would benefit from some of this clearer language as well. This reminds me of George Orwell's advice on writing. In his 1946 essay on politics and the English language, which I think should be on any writer's must-read and reread list, he points out that ugly and inaccurate language is partly the outcome of foolish thoughts, but it also makes us easier to have foolish thoughts. If thought corrupts language, language can also corrupt thought, Orwell says. Imprecise, unclear language is often used to defend the indefensible. Orwell gives this example. If someone during his era, in the 1940s, wanted to explain the thinking of Soviet leaders at the time, A clear and accurate statement of Soviet leaders' philosophy would be, I quote, "I believe in killing off your opponents when you can get good results by doing so." But of course, this is too naked, too true a statement of what the Soviet leaders were actually thinking. So instead, if you want to justify their thinking, you would wrap it up in euphemisms and cloudy vagueness like this, quote, "While freely conceding that the Soviet regime exhibits certain features which the humanitarian may be inclined to deplore, we must, I think, agree that a certain curtailment of the right to political opposition is an unavoidable concomitant of transitional periods." Yeah. And Orwell, I think, quite correctly points out that this vague language, in fact, disguises what is a simple truth that the Soviets leaders believe, that it is okay to kill people who get in your way. Euphemisms have this morally corrupting impact. So in my writing for adults, I continue to aspire to the standards of precision and clarity that Orwell demands. And I think What's Up has been pretty good practice. The second big lesson I've learned in the course of writing and editing for children is to be far more sensitive to the difference between what's interesting and what's important. In journalism, there is a tension between the two. Media scholars, together with more thinking journalists, have known this for a long time. Journalists use certain rules of thumb to predict how appealing a story will be to a mass audience. And through centuries of trial and error, journalists across the world have honed these principles into pretty robust formula. For example, journalists know that events that are sudden and unusual, that are close to home and have a direct impact on people, will tend to attract greater interest and are therefore treated as more newsworthy. What these news formulae don't do is to indicate how significant and important those newsworthy events are. And there are happenings of undeniably great significance, like climate change, that unfortunately rank low in newsworthiness because the impact is extremely gradual compared with, say, a plane crash or an earthquake, and the solutions to climate change, which is negotiations in highly technical meetings, are simply not as sexy as a tweet from Donald Trump. So responsible journalists know that they should instead try to make the significant interesting and not pretend that what's merely interesting is always significant. But to be fair to journalists, it's extremely difficult to push back against these conventional standards of newsworthiness. The audience has certain expectations. And if you don't go with the flow, if you ignore what everyone else considers the news of the month, like a royal wedding, for example, people may think you're out of touch, you're a frog in the well, and not doing your job. So a lot of adult journalism is trapped by convention. When I started working on What's Up, it dawned on me that children don't have such expectations yet. So I was relatively free of those inherited rules defining what is news. Now, we're not completely free to redefine news, of course, and nor should we want to be. We do want to give children some inkling about the news that the adults around them are talking about. But to a large extent, What's Up can decide for ourselves what's really significant and what's just noise and distraction. With that freedom to set our own agenda, comes responsibility. And so I've had to try to educate myself in order to make those better editorial judgments concerning what citizens of the world need to know. And if we do take that trouble to go beyond news headlines, if we ask experts what in fact are the most serious threats facing humans, it turns out we'll get a slightly different list from what the media consider to be the most important or interesting events of the day. Experts would tell you that the threats to human survival are in fact not the terrorist attacks or the aeroplane crashes that dominate the news cycles when they happen. Instead, along with catastrophic climate change, scientists will talk about food security, water scarcity, and disease, the next global pandemic, for example. So at What's Up, we regularly try to put these stories on our agenda, even though we rarely see them highlighted in adult media. We think we can also be better than our adult media at gauging who is important. Mainstream media reflect and reinforce the global tendency to treat rich white societies as more deserving of attention, as inherently more interesting than poor non-white societies. So as a result, in Singapore, we get top news defined like this. Apparently, Bieber is going to marry a Baldwin, tagged as one of the top stories on straitstimes.com this week. Now, this is a mental map that is, unfortunately, again, very difficult for adult media to fight. Let's be honest, if the Straits Times carried as much news from Africa as it does from the United States, most of us would find it extremely odd. But again, being free of these adult conventions has allowed us at What's Up to look at the world in a way through more innocent eyes. So at What's Up, we make it a point to create a picture of the world that isn't dominated by Western places and faces. In our coming issue, for example, we profile a young doctor from Malaysia who's helping Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh, and a leading female breakdancer who also happens to be a kindergarten teacher in Japan. Oh, and I guess it should go without saying that we also have a strong gender equality agenda. The question of who's important doesn't just apply on the global stage. It's also relevant locally right here in Singapore. One of the most universal and yet least commented on biases that the media are guilty of worldwide is the bias for those sections of the public that have the disposable income to consume the goods and services that advertisers are keen to market through the media. And so whether the media are left-wing or right-wing, liberal or conservative, their reliance on advertising means that they share this common mission. They promote consumption. Most media around the world try to create, therefore, an editorial environment that is conducive to advertising, such as lifestyle pages that promote self-fulfillment through buying more, through fashion and food. And again, because What's Up is not dependent on commercial advertising, and because we are content to operate as a sustainable social enterprise rather than as a profit-maximizing business, we are free to think differently about our audience and its needs. So from the start, we've taken a stand against sugary drinks. We promote a healthy body image. And one of the only fashion spreads we've ever done is about the humble t-shirt. Producing a newspaper for Singapore's school children has forced me to think about what they can and cannot afford, to remember that many children come from families of modest means and that some are struggling to get by, and that the last thing we should do is to make those kids feel that they don't belong if they don't possess that coveted gadget or game, or if they haven't gone on that expensive overseas vacation. We instead emphasize human relationships over consumption as the route to personal fulfillment, like this series that Mary did a while back on fitting in. A friend of mine, Teo Yu Yen, has written a marvelous book that you may have read titled "This is What Inequality Looks Like." She writes that the stories we tell ourselves about Singapore favor those who have made it in life. These narratives ignore the fact that for the low income, Singapore is a city of limited movement, physical hardship, and a strong sense that they will go nowhere. Now, it is not that the low-income Singaporeans have nothing going for them, she emphasizes. They and their children possess resilience, independence, and generosity But these, unfortunately, are not the values that Singapore prizes or rewards, Yu Yan points out. Reading her book showed me how difficult it is for a middle-class professional like me to transcend my socio-economic bubble. Working on WhatsApp has given me the extra incentive to try. The final set of lessons I've learned while working on WhatsApp has to do with how to deal with bad news. Now, in case you haven't noticed, we journalists love bad news. There's a saying, in fact, no news is good news, which is another way of saying that if everything's going well, it doesn't require a big headline, a news alert, or a tweet. Another journalistic cliche is, if it bleeds, it leads. Crime, conflict, disasters are what tend to lead news bulletins. Now, it's tempting to blame profit-seeking news media for these sensationalist tendencies, but that would be, I think, an incomplete and possibly dishonest explanation. If we ask why audiences are drawn to these types of stories in the first place, well, social science research will tell us that people's demand for bad news could be something that's hardwired in us as a survival skill. We, in fact, do need to know about new threats to our well-being so that we can respond to them right away. In addition, paradoxically, highlighting bad news is one way we remind ourselves of what's good. Crime stories, for example, help to signpost what society sees as the line between right and wrong, or as sociologists would put it, highlighting norm violations helps reinforce the norm. But even if there are good reasons why news media should focus disproportionately on the negative, news for kids shouldn't follow the same rules. It has to be developmentally appropriate. In the earliest discussions that Mary and I had about WhatsApp, we knew that the principle, first do no harm, would be non-negotiable. But in a world where so much of the news, if it were a movie, would be rated PG, NC-16, M18, or even R21. Is it possible to tell the news with a child-safe G rating? Well, we guarantee it. Parents and teachers can be confident that everything in WhatsApp is child-safe. Mary, as our child development specialist, reads 100% of our content before publication. And mind you, while many media companies catering to the children's market may have child psychologists on retainer as consultants, Mary's expertise here is not on tap, but on top. She owns and runs the enterprise with me. We have no other shareholders to account to, and she has an absolute final say in deciding whether any proposed content violates our commitment to be child safe. Now, it would be easy if we simply decided to censor all bad news and make WhatsApp a happy newspaper. But as you would have figured out by now, making life easy for ourselves has never been our touchstone, unfortunately. So we don't shy away from distressing events. WhatsApp has covered child soldiers, refugee crises, Ebola, plastic waste. In many months, I feel WhatsApp is a more serious and depressing read than many adult newspapers. So our goal isn't to quarantine kids so that they don't have to confront the ugliness that is out there. Rather, our approach is to place that bad news in perspective. And fortunately, even in the real world, if we bother to look, we can always find those people who step forward to help. Even the victims of crises are often capable of amazing resilience. We know that even in societies far less developed than our own, ordinary people have agency and are capable of not only helping themselves but also their neighbors. So the stories are out there to tell. And again, it turns out that these lessons are equally valid for adults. Media research shows that negative news in a media-saturated world has the unintended consequence of cultivating unnecessarily cynical publics. For example, people in media-rich environments tend to overestimate the level of crime in their societies. Media scholars have called this the mean world syndrome. Annual surveys in the US show that around 7 in 10 Americans will tell you that crime in the country is rising. They're convinced of it, when in fact it's been falling for the last 25 years. You may think, well, maybe there's no harm done if, this misperception about the world getting scarier, about crime rising, helps make people more vigilant. The problem, though, is that such misrepresentations, such misperceptions, can make people so fearful that they are less trusting of their fellow citizens. And with low trust, people are less likely to want to work together to solve problems. In the book Enlightenment Now, which Bill Gates called his favorite book of all time, Steven Pinker makes this very point. He says that the media have unintentionally painted such a gloomy picture of our present and future that people are losing faith in society's capacity for gradual, incremental improvement. Now, he does acknowledge that some of this negativity, pessimism, does have a bright side, does have a purpose. They are, in fact, an indicator of the fact that we are now more aware of the things that are going wrong and more bothered by it. There are harms that would have passed unnoticed in the past, but today are considered outrageous and unacceptable. That's a good thing. But he says that this relentless negativity can have the unintended consequence of indiscriminate cynicism. Now, of course, it's possible that the cynics are right. Maybe they have good reason to feel that the end of the world is coming. Now, this is a difficult point to address because pessimism is partly subjective. We all know people who are inclined to see gray cloud instead of silver lining. So overall, should we act in this world in hope, or should we just give up in despair and place all our bets on the afterlife? Pinker points out that there are some trends you can objectively measure. So even discounting the fact that pessimism is partly subjective, has to do with our personalities, there are some things that you can actually objectively measure, like crime statistics that I mentioned, or you can count the prevalence of illness and disease, or hunger and famine. You can measure the likelihood of an infant or child dying, of a mother dying in childbirth, whether people have shelter or clean water and air. Nobody would claim that any of these are trivial matters. And in every one of these indicators, the evidence is that life today is objectively better than it was 50 or 100 or more years ago. Now, Pinker makes the additional crucial point that none of these improvements, longer, healthier lives, better chances that your babies will actually survive and that mothers will survive childbirth, etc., none of this happened by accident or some lucky miracle. It involved people using their heads, working together through science and technology, and finding new ways of organizing society. It required people coming together to write new laws, safety regulations, anti-discrimination laws. It also arose from society's moral development. Collectively, although we might not often feel it, we do have a bigger heart than we did a century ago. Because we've been able to share stories across borders, and because there's greater recognition of our shared humanity than there was, it's gotten much harder to look away from human suffering. A century ago, the well-being of people of the wrong color or class was treated as something insignificant. Today, the idea of strangers near or far facing unnecessary suffering or death is far less acceptable than it was. Of course, it's nowhere where it should be, but it's clear we are making moral progress as a planet. Now, Pinkler argues that if we don't understand what enabled these improvements, if we give up faith in society's ability to improve life a little bit year by year, we will in fact create a self-fulfilling prophecy. Life will indeed go downhill, and the lives of our children and grandchildren will be far worse than our own. So in this respect as well, I've realized that the lessons I've imbibed as a writer for children are actually extremely relevant for us as adults. That as adults, we, yes, have a moral responsibility to see clearly the problems facing our societies, but also to understand how our powers of reason and cooperation can be applied to make things better, or at least to avoid the worst, and to never give up hope. I'd like to end with a story that's been on our minds this week, that of the young Thai football team and their coach, who were trapped deep in a cave for 2.5 weeks. Obviously, this is going to be our page one story in our next issue. And here I make no apologies that what the mainstream media considered page one news, What's Up wholeheartedly agrees. The plight of these boys was the stuff of nightmares. But the happy ending crystallizes so much of what we believe at What's Up. The incredible resilience of these children and their coach, the international cooperation triggered by their plight, the sacrifice of individuals who put others before themselves, the use of the latest science and technology to solve practical problems, and above all, the human capacity to sympathize with others, including total strangers. Still underdeveloped, of course, still a work in progress, but this incredible story shows the potential of this duty of care that we hold within us. And we think if we cultivate it in ourselves and in the young, this surely is the ultimate antidote to all the bad news around us, the best way to nurture citizens of the world. So on behalf of the What's Up team, thank you for working with us and believing with us that children deserve the chance to learn about the world that they'll inherit. Thank you.